Welcome to the Virtual Festival of Innovation here in Malvern, and today I'm talking with Paul Walker, MBE, who is the chair of the Worcestershire LEP, but also non-executive director of the Malvern Hills Science Park. So Paul's been involved in the tech ecosystem and the innovation ecosystem here in Malvern for some time, but also you are the MD of Malvern Instruments, that
Indeed.
later was Malvern Panalytical. So what we're going to do today is talk about some of the issues of scaling businesses and the help that people need in doing that. So with your background with Malvern Instruments, take us back to how it was when you first got involved in Malvern Instruments.
Well, it was a long time ago, but I think I characterised Malvern Instruments when I joined. So I joined in the mid-90s, and as you know, it was a company born and bred in Malvern, the association spin out from Kinetic, but it was very much a technically led company, a bunch of very clever people who were focused on getting as much as they could out of laser diffraction technology, and they became really very good at it. They produced probably the best technology embodied in an instrument in the world at that time, and had already begun to develop a reputation through research institutes across the world. They were already exporting this best-in-class instrument.
Yep.
And just before I arrived, it was a privately held company, and it was sold to an organisation, a PLC, a small PLC, that frankly made rather a hash of the acquisition,
Right.
and didn't really understand what the company was doing, but it had some interesting numbers attached to it in terms of turnover. It was about 10 or 12 million by that time. I had 100 or so people in Malvern. But the process was painful for the company. It went through something of a culture shock, which resulted in it being sold again and acquired by the group that owned it when I joined as
Right.
CEO. And they were very clear that, having invested the money they had in buying Malvern, they were very keen in seeing a return on that investment. But to their eternal credit, they understood this would be a process. It was a 5-year view.
Right.
And I said we were about 10, 12 million at that time, and their target was, we want you to be 50 million in 5 years' time. And so the first thing was, well, how are we going to get there? And we didn't. There was no strategic plan for the company at that time. So that was the first thing, really, that with my colleagues on the board at that time, we had a famous away day and said, well, here we are. That's where we've got to get to. How are we going to do it?
Yeah.
And I think essentially the challenge was to understand, in a classic SWOT sense, what we were good at, what we weren't, and critically, what was happening out there, how was the market developing? And I think that was the key that unravelled the conundrum that was how we were going to get there. Because in truth, what was happening is, in an era when, as you know, perhaps Malvern's focus was particle size analysis, which sounds very boring, but actually has, and was emerging in all sorts of industries at that time.
Yep.
In an environment where quality systems, this was one of the key drivers, the influx of ISO 9000, and suppliers need to demonstrate that their products were actually doing what it says on the tin, and they were that specification, prompted a drive globally then to invest in instrumentation, really, that enabled them to guarantee to their buyer, this is the size of it, and this is... So there was an emerging, burgeoning market globally, and that had spawned many competitors. Small ones, but they were not very visible to us, because our focus was really about research institutes. It was about having the best possible instrument, driving the technology to its limit. And really that was the key, was to turn that into something that was more commercially focused, that understood better than we did at that time how those markets were developing, how demand from pharmaceutical companies, cement companies, all sorts of companies that were now much more interested, whether they like to be or not, in producing supplies and components to feed those industries, which had a much more rigorous quality assessment to it.
And I mean, you were making, as a company, you were making physical products.
Yes, indeed.
As well as embedding software to make it work. So there are
Yes.
challenges with physical products because you've got to get those made and off the shelf. How did that work and how did you scale that?
I think if I can describe the culture, it was really technology-led. So we had a very capable R&D department
Yeah.
who really ran the company. That was the real heritage of the company, was leveraging the last you could get out of the technology. But everything else was really secondary importance,
Right.
whether that was making them. Our operational capability was average, to put it mildly. Things like customer support, customer service, these things were of all secondary importance. So we had to turn that around and begin to invest, as you say, in order to make sure that not only could we could design the best instrument in the world,
Yeah.
but that you could make it efficiently at the right price, at the right time. I mean, lead times for some of those things were ages.
Yeah.
3-month delivery if your customer was prepared to wait. I mean, that simply wasn't good enough. And so there was a lot of emphasis on developing our operational capability, looking at lean manufacturing and
Yeah.
cell manufacturing, focusing on customer support. And so it was rebalancing the company to make it commercially led, really sales led,
Yes.
customer led in the end. That's where we needed to be, rather than only technology led. Not that technology didn't remain
Yeah,
a very
it's
important
key.
part of the business, of course.
So, and then when you were sort of almost switching your focus from academic customers to commercial customers,
That was-
the demands would have been, I would have thought, higher in a way because the commercial customers would need the product quickly or...
That's very true, but they were also different in another subtle way that became very important for us to understand, that many of the leading research institutes across the world, in China, Russia, America, they loved the instrument. They wanted it to be as good as it possibly could. And the instinctive focus of the company was to make its resolution better, its dynamic range better. It became a technical challenge to get as much out of the technology as possible. But to your point, the consumer, the business element, the companies that wanted an instrument, they needed other things. Like they'd like it delivered in 1 month, not 3.
Yep.
They'd like it not to break down. They wanted it to be installed. They needed application support. They needed to understand, well, it's given me this answer. What does that answer mean? They didn't necessarily need the best thing in the world, most precise answer in the world. They needed to be consistent, reliable.
Yeah.
And a critical thing we began to understand was, as these were going into quality control laboratories, many of them,
Right.
they weren't being run by people with PhDs who spent years understanding and nurturing their instrument, as many people in research organizations
Yep.
do. They needed to walk in the lab, put the sample in, hit the button, and get the answer.
Yeah.
So the demands on the way the instrument was designed and developed shifted in a very important way. It needed to be, we used to have the phrase that perfect is the enemy of the good.
Right, that's interesting.
And that
yeah.
drive to make everything perfect, particularly with technology, isn't necessarily what you need to do to become an agile and responsive organisation that understands actually the needs of the customer, which in a quality control lab were very different than they were in a research laboratory.
Yeah,
So
so-
yes, you're
yeah.
right.
And that's really important in taking the company on its growth phase. I mean, obviously the customers were overseas as
Yes,
well.
nearly all of them, in
How did you
fact.
cope with, well, exporting, but
Yes.
also the customer support that you need to provide in these other territories?
That was critical about that cultural change, that we already exported 80 or 90% because they were to the research institutes outside the UK. So the UK was never a critical market for us, but our routes to market overseas were primarily through agents and distributors.
Right.
And they were a wide variety of competence in the, and we had 30 or 40 even then, and some of them were really very good and understood their market. They already sold other products to those customers, so they were very customer focused. They needed it supported and serviced, but others not so much. But it was a third party relationship, obviously, and in the key territories, I mean the US obviously, I think at the point I joined in the 90s, we had one direct sales operation in France, and everywhere else we more or less successfully exported through agents and distributors.
Right.
So as part of that growth plan, that clearly wasn't going to be sufficient in our view for the view. And this was an investment issue. Do we invest more in product, or which we chose to do, invested more in our own routes to market. So setting up the US clearly was a critical market for us, particularly in the pharmaceutical sector, which was a very growing and valuable sector to us. So we established a sales office with an application. So this became a key focus of our investment rather than solely in technology or capability.
So when you expand overseas then, and you can obviously use an agency model like you were explaining, or you can put an office somewhere. What are the challenges with that as a company that's aspiring to do it?
Yeah, and they're not easy. I mean, it's one of the things that's easier to say and very desirable. It's not. So it's a brave thing to do, to go and recruit 2 or 3 people and put them and lease an office in wherever, Boston for us. But the drive to do it becomes an understanding of what that future opportunity is, about really understanding how your market is evolving and developing and what the future prospects for it are. And therefore, that's obviously why we chose the US, because it represented, in our view at that time, it wasn't a bad guess, about 1/3 of the potential market we had for the products that we currently had. And we already had some ideas of how we would want to add to that product range and develop to hit that 50 million. But it is a risk in the sense of any investment has a risk. And investing in sales channels is often a longer term return than you'd like.
Yeah. So research is key then, as in understanding the markets.
I think that's rule number one, really, looking back.
Yeah.
I think we were fortunate in having some people in the company who'd been in that sector a long time, although they weren't perhaps listened to as carefully as they subsequently came to be. And we put a great deal of effort in investing in the sort of market research tools and information and surveys. And that became a great deal easier once you had your own operation. That becomes as self-fulfilling because you have your own people there who understand, you can talk to them, and you can direct them really to understand much more about what's being sold and what's not and why customers like it. And that becomes a very positive influence on that growth curve.
That's interesting. And what about in terms of the growing pains, the staff? How do you retain staff, find staff, particularly if you're in a smallish town like Malvern?
That was always a challenge, and in a way still is. Malvern's a lovely place to live, and it didn't have very high unemployment anyway. But I think one of the critical things was, in order to have the capacity to achieve those outputs, we needed to move the company. We bought new premises. We were lucky to get some investment from our parent group to do that. And we built the factory that's still there. And that coincided with a key point in terms of the changing culture of the company. We were investing heavily in cell manufacturing, lean manufacturing. So the company was going through a lot of change, and it was the ideal time, fortunately, to then have a new factory that we could design from the bottom up. And instead of being lots of rooms down a corridor and at the end you walked into production,
right?
It became almost, it was a completely open plan, it was flexible working, there were teams, it was oriented to become a company that by then had 200 people in Malvern who worked together as a team. It wasn't a series of silos, and it develops a silo mentality where you're just focused on designing the instrument. You don't even know any of the issues that operations have or service. I remember we designed one famous instrument where there were 17 screws to take the cover off. So you go out to Kazakhstan in the research, and the first thing the engineer has to do is undo 17 screws. I mean, it was that thinking. I mean, it's a trivial, amusing thing, but it indicates how you need to change the culture to become one team and not a series of silos, really.
Yes, and as the company grows, communication across it is a real challenge. So how did you structure it as it grew in terms of like management teams, and what was your approach?
That's a good question and not easy to answer, but I think the key difference was, back to that silo, we had departments. We had a head of service and a head of R&D, and their focus was on that element of the company's operation. Whereas in reality, as you know, almost everything you do in a company is part of a process.
Yeah.
And through this period of change, we literally mapped and drew out what happened in the business from a customer even before that, from marketing and lead generation, how it's qualified, when the order's placed, what that triggers. And you realize more and more, it was a learning journey for us all, how many of the key things in a business that you need to happen properly are actually processes. They exist
Yeah.
cross-departmentally and interdepartmentally. And that fostered the culture then of what we always was, nearly everything we did was through a multidisciplinary project team,
Right.
which took people from service, and that's when we started to design new products.
Mm-hmm.
We didn't have an R&D team. We had a project manager that had, of course, technical experts in them, but they also had someone from manufacturing, someone from marketing, and a product manager in there, and they worked together as a multidisciplinary
That's
team.
a good idea. I can see that working. And the other way that you grew, I think, is by acquisition, by taking on other companies.
We were very fortunate in having a parent group who, once we got to 50 million, they thought this is good.
Right.
So it became
The
the
next
next target.
Yep.
So then we had to say, well, how are we going to do that? And by that time, because we'd established, I think, 6 or 7 overseas sales operations, direct sales,
Yeah.
US, Japan, China, the US, I mean, that became one of our key strengths. So the strategy then was to leverage those routes to market. We had a very good customer service operation. Our brand
Right.
was perceived as being a quality brand that was well supported. Then the strategy for growth became, what other problems do our customers have that we could acquire, develop, and provide solutions to using those same routes to market, like leveraging the relationships we had with some of the Glaxos and Pfizers of this world. But I mean, they're worth listening to, and we did.
So if you found a company that you wanted to acquire, what was the process for checking them out, and how did you absorb them into your ecosystem?
There were a couple of companies that we acquired, but our focus was very much that story of saying, well, here's a customer who wants to understand how to measure colloids.
Right.
So these weren't hard particles, these were liquid in liquid systems. And the problem, most of our technologies were light-based technologies, which means you need the light to go through the sample. And many of those colloids, of course, they're dense. And we found a company in Germany, it was a family company, a very bright man who'd come up with a patent that could enable you to determine the structure of colloid systems by looking at the light that was scattered back.
Oh, yeah.
And it was called non-invasive backscattering. It was a small company near Frankfurt. There were only 4 people, family-run company, and we got to know them because we had a German operation at that time, and they'd come. So this is where the communication and understanding starts to develop. But in the end, what we did was acquired a license for that technology. Right. So it wasn't the company that we were interested in as much as the people, because he was the 2 very clever guys there, and the technology that they developed. So we in-licensed the technology, and that became, well, probably the best acquisition we made was actually of a technology.
Yeah.
So although there were some company acquisitions further downstream, a key half of that growth was acquiring technologies, and the other half being the progressive growth of those products that we already had. It was a hybrid of both.
So the intellectual property becomes very important. And
Absolutely.
Do you think that underpins the value of the business entirely, or what's your
No,
view on that?
we had many long debates about the issues of intellectual property, because in truth we were a company that was very strong around, well, originally we had R&D, but in a way that was a misnomer, I think, because it was heavily D, and we really weren't a lot of R. And part of that change in culture of the company remapped the process to something we called MPI, New Product Introduction.
Oh, okay.
Which really starts with that market, customer need, and flowing back to say, how can we solve this problem and bring it through production and service? So those multidisciplinary project teams weren't R&D teams, they were new product introduction teams. So the accent, the focus of the company, one of our key strengths, I think, became we were very good at that process.
Yeah.
But of course, you still need the innovation and the ideas at the front end. And you talked about culture earlier, and it became a very well-developed and efficient process of how you take something through to an end product. Yeah. But that front end, the innovation bit, the catalyst often for a particular direction. That's a very different, I think in my experience, you need a very different culture. Because an MPI process necessarily is quite structured, it's gates and gateways and tests and done in a quality environment and procedures and documentation, and it should be.
Yeah, yeah.
But it's almost countercultural to somewhat of a left field idea.
Yep.
So eventually we got quite large. We did acquire a company in the US on the East Coast. Effectively, they had come up with this very clever idea that we liked. We had an early beta model in production. We acquired the company to take that product through. But I was so impressed with these five. There were 5 guys, in fact. And the culture of this tiny team, they just lived and breathed. Let's try this. They were very innovative. It was a very loose and collegiate and unstructured.
Yep.
But they came up with some very interesting ideas. So, in a sense, we had the rigorous strictures of new product introduction here in the UK and Malvern.
Yep.
But many of the ideas, and of course they were catalysts for ideas that then prompted the leverage of the skills and people we had in the UK. It was a balance, but it was easier doing it in 2 locations because the cultures are very different.
So now you're involved in the Science Park, have been for quite a few years, and you can obviously see lots of smaller companies in the Science Park, and of course the big hope is that out of some of those small companies will be the next Malvern Instruments.
Yes, that
and
was
the next
part of the idea.
Do you think we have the right support in place to help with that process, and what else could be done for those kind of early stage Science Park companies?
And it's a key question, and from Science Park's point of view, whilst it's been a great success story from the point of view of coming from nothing to what it is now, I think what we've learned along the way is that there's a difference between providing the buildings and the brand and the address and the IT. For companies, most companies need much more than that. They need active engagement, support in a sense of providing them with advice, guidance, rather than just a building and facilities. Yeah. And that's a transition the Science Park is still going through. And in the role I am now, in the local enterprise partnership, things like BetaDen and the Growth Hub have also magnified the challenge of how you best do that. That the build it and they will come kind of focus on growth. It works in some places, but here we know already, and we have evidence of it, that if you can provide some of the key inputs, advice, guidance to these fledgling companies, as many of them are, you stand a much better chance collectively of getting to where you want to be.
No, that's really interesting. Good. Well, thank you very much, Paul. It's been a fascinating talk.
Thank you for asking.
And I think lots of people could learn from following a journey like you've described, and how the bigger companies do it, and how they deal with the problems, and applying that to the smaller businesses. So thank you very much for watching. Do join us again for another session with the virtual Malvern Festival Innovation. Thank you.